Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. How is everybody out there in the listenership and viewership of AllPointsTV.com doing? I am George Moss, and I'm back 2 weeks from my travels in Europe, and it's so good to be back here. And we're looking forward to today, after this program is over. Satori's Black History Corner comes on at 3:30, and it's still around about 4 o'clock. I'm looking forward to that as I rush home after this program is over, and we tape this program, and I'll see it live during that time period. We are always glad to have you with us here at the studio, because without you, our programs will not have any purpose, and your tuning it in is an honor to us, and we want to definitely show our appreciation for your having taken of your time to tune us in. I want you to watch all the programs here at the studio. Everyone here is putting in a lot of time that you don't see on the air. Many people think you just come to the studio and just plop down in a chair and start talking. It takes a lot of time. And I know what goes into these cable programs where you see these guys, they do 5 hours a week, and people think, well, they're only doing 1 hour a day, but they don't see the preparation that goes into it. And they see people on the air doing the 1 hour time that they're actually in front of the camera. But they have no idea how much input, meeting with all your team players and your writers and putting things in organized format, that takes a lot of time. And we know that from what we do here at the studio. Before we come to the studio, as a matter of fact, we have a lot of things already worked out. Then there's some additional things we do once we get here. Anyway, I am very glad to be back. I'm having recovered now over, I guess I didn't have jet lag when I came back, because I wasn't on the jet as much as I was in the airports getting ready to get on the jet. I had airport lag, because we were in airports. I was in one airport I had been in the airport more than 20 some hours, because the flights I missed flights because they had some planes were late and that backed up. Other flights were missed. And my time was spent in airports waiting. I'm sometimes waiting for a day. But it wasn't. I guess I can't say that I have jet lag when I got back, because I wasn't on. I was in the airport more than I was on the planes. But it was a very enjoyable trip, and I learned a lot about Europe. And I can tell you that I learned a lot about what Europeans think about us here in the United States. And it is not all good. It's amazing some of the things that I heard while I was on this trip. And I think next year, if it's still there, I'm going to be going to France. I was in Amsterdam this past trip. But I want to go to the Louvre in Paris. So I hope things calm down there, and by next summer they'll be ready to receive me as I go right from here to another. I'm not going to Chicago again, and I'm not flying that airline. I'm not going to mention the name, but I'm not going to fly that particular airline again. I'm going to be going through another airline, and my connecting flight will not be the one I met over there in Europe, because I can't have them out there fixing the plane, and I got to watch them going in the engine fixing the plane. I got to get on the plane later on with how much confidence I get on the plane with. But that's in the future, and I'm going to be hopefully having a better time in dealing with the travel. Today we are going to talk about a couple of topics. One just came up, and that's the one about the stock market that was down when the stock market opened this morning at 9 o'clock. It took a dive of 1,000 points. The Dow went down by 1,000 points, and the latest report is that it rallied back from that point down 1,000 points. It's now down 337 points, and a lot of people are being hurt out there. And I'm going to tell you what I think is happening, because I'm not so keen on accepting what I'm hearing about the reason why the stock market went down so drastically over the last 2 days, starting this past weekend. And we knew that when the stock market opened today, that we would have some more turbulence. And I don't know, John, if you have a view on why this downturn took place so drastically, but I'm not really accepting what I'm hearing, and I want to give a few ideas that I've come up with about what this downward movement is about and why it's taking place at this point in time. I think first of all, the timing of it has to do with some scapegoat that can be placed out in front of the public as to what is causing it, and that scapegoat is China. Supposedly they are doing certain things with their currency, and there are certain things they're doing in terms of the manipulation of their own economy and how that affects in a spiraling way the economies around the world. And then out of that comes this downturn that takes place at a time when that finger pointing is going on. But I don't think that that's really what caused this trauma, this turbulence in the market that we're seeing here. You have to keep in mind how the stock market operates. The stock market doesn't really care where the money comes from. When you put money in the stock market, whether the money is clean money, corrupted money, money through some kind of underhanded kind of operation, money laundering, it doesn't care about any of that. All it recognizes dollars being put into the process, and the reactions based upon it will go about their end based upon the kind of money that's being pumped in and the confidence that it shores up in the stock market. And I think what we're seeing here is that the federal government, which was dumping $75 to $85 billion into the economy monthly, I think that stopping of that dumping of the currency in the economy, where at the back end of it, you would have the feds taking out the inflationary aspects of that, which is in fact having a zero interest rate. So what I think is happening, and I'm going to be listening to the economists on this a lot more. I'm not claiming to be the economists that some of them are out there. I do have a degree in economics, but I'm not claiming that I'm another Milton Friedman, for example. Although I'm not so sure that his expertise was in this particular realm of economics. He was a great theorist. My analysis of it differs just a little bit from what I've been hearing on the way to the studio and some of the things that were said this morning on some of the networks that were discussing this downward spiral. I see it as a couple of things that has to do with the superficiality of the stock market based upon the dumping that's occurred of the currency that's been inflated and dumped into the stock market to make it appear that the economy is churning at a faster rate in which it is in fact going on, which goes along with this view that's been put out that we have an unemployment rate of 5.5%, 5.6%, somewhere around that number. And I do not buy that as being real. There's too many people out of the workforce. The labor participation rate is only about 62% of the workforce. When you add in the 92 million people who are outside the workforce, those numbers that are reported of 5.5 to 5.6 of the workforce being unemployed, which is almost like full employment, that just doesn't jive with the labor participation rate, which I think is a much more honest indicator of how well the economy is actually doing. I don't think it's as high as what Donald Trump is saying, but it certainly is much higher than what they're reporting. Donald Trump's numbers, one report had him saying it was around 42%, and then he said between 20-something to about 40-some-odd percent of the workforce being unemployed. I don't think it's that high, but I do think it's much higher than what is being reported. I would put it somewhere around 1 in 5. And then we have to talk about the underemployment. So in keeping with the statistics that we're getting about the unemployment rate, I don't take it as a leap of faith that they are telling us the truth that the stock market is crashing because of exterior circumstance, but nothing to do with anything that's happening here as far as the policies of this country. I think the policies of this country are quite primary to what's going on. And what I think is happening is that over a period of time, the Feds were expanding the currency. And you know, when the Feds expand the currency, that is an inflationary practice. In other words, inflation is nothing other than government dumping more money into the economic bloodstream, and you don't have an increasing amount of product that those dollars are in fact chasing. So you have a lot of dollars being put into the currency stream, and you don't have a production that would accommodate the increased money. What the Feds do when they do that and dump it into the stock market to take the inflationary aspect of it out, what they do is that they put the interest rate at zero, and by putting it at zero with them inflating the currency, the inflation is taken out of it by them backing the inflation out through the money that is placed in savings. That's whether in banks or in stock market. They back out the inflation by not paying anything on the money that's sitting there to be put into investment. And so after they stop doing that, what happens is that the market then begins to go into a correction, because you're not dumping $75 billion to $85 billion of money into the bloodstream of the economy. Most of it going into the stock market, which, as I said, doesn't care where it gets its money from, because the stock market is more or less like what some call a whore, meaning that bring the money, we don't care where the money is derived from, just dump it in here, and then it will create a spark and a reaction. It doesn't ask where the money came from. It certainly just recognizes the money that is in fact placed into the investment cycle or the stock market. When that process goes on for a period of time and then you stop it, and of course you stop it at a certain point, and you can stop it so that something else can get the blame for it, which is what I think is going on here. I think that it was stopped at a certain point because then it can blame it, as they are doing, upon what is happening elsewhere. And the politicians and those who are creating a condition through which we are in fact growing our debt by these inflationary practices, we can then export the reason for it as an external fact, rather than internal, to which there therefore is some blame to be placed upon those who are the money manipulators in this country. And I think politically, this was the time in which that could take place because of what is happening in China. But China does not explain what is taking place here. I think the policies in Washington explain it. The Federal Reserve System and the money supply being increased and dumped in the stock market, and then all of a sudden brakes are put upon that, and then we have this fallout as a result of that. So I am going to be listening to others that discuss this, but I do think that is pretty much in the ballpark of what is taking place at the present time. And it is going to get much rougher out there because we have an artificial economy right now because there are too many regulations on the economy. And these regulations are stifling our growth. I was telling you last week that I read the book that was written in 1942 by this economist named Schumpeter. The book was updated 30 years later, 1972, and it was retitled from its original title. The original title was Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And the new title is 30 years later, in 1972, was the title of the book, which was Can Capitalism Survive? And I was very surprised in reading the book that Schumpeter, he's deceased now, he was a capitalist. I was surprised, quite frankly, in his conclusion that capitalism would not, that he did not feel capitalism would survive. But his premise is quite an interesting one as to why he would draw that conclusion. Because it's not him saying that he hopes it won't survive. He was saying that he did not think it would survive. And for these particular set of circumstances, the key one being that it's not in the interest of those who are the ones in government to allow it to survive, because in the inner workings of capitalism, if it in fact is allowed to work, it then brings about a certain amount of political obsolescence of those in leadership. And therefore, it kind of consigns them to the sidelines, so to speak. And then you have the capitalists that are in control, because the other ones of influence, because they're the ones in charge of making things happen in the economy. And the political class is in fact threatened by that. The contradiction he talks about is that the political class, which is put in charge of protecting the capitalist system, is put in a catch-22. To do that, and while it's churning out creativity and innovation and things of that sort, and relegating them to the sidelines, the political class to the sidelines, it creates a situation where there is this competition for influence, and the political class doesn't want the influence to go to the capitalist class. They want to have the political class getting the credit for what is happening, because they have to go before the electorate and they have to have some results they can actually show as to why they should stay in power because of what they're doing. Wherein the capitalist class is voted upon by the consumers who go to the stores and consume their products. And their verdict is in dollars. If they're not doing a good job, then they go out of business. But the voters go out of business if the persons that vote for them do not think they're doing a good job. And so therefore, the political class has a vested interest in, to some extent, holding down the capitalist class. And that's why he felt that the capitalist class, the capitalist system would not in fact survive, because the ones have to rely upon that for its defense and for its longevity. He makes another interesting point, which is the point that is not so much Karl Marx and others, those who are the socialists, that are pretending that capitalism will at some point meet its end, but he makes the point that within the capitalist structure itself, because it is innovative, because it in fact engages in what I think it says in chapter 4, it engages in what he calls creative destruction. That is, by it being innovative, by it in fact making certain jobs obsolete, it gets to a place where the market that it has gotten involved in and gotten in front of, at some point the markets shrink. And its capitalist opportunities, its capitalistic opportunities are in fact more remote because of that process of innovation. And then the question comes up, what then do the politicians do when people, for example, are not employed and out of work and things of that sort? And then you see then people being created like Bernie Sanders, who comes along talking about redistributing the wealth and having a rearrangement of the income so that everyone gets a piece of the pie. And it always works very well at the very beginning of the funnel, where the capitalist system is just now beginning to be on pause. But as that pause becomes a way of life in the network, then you see what happens then over a period of time, as you saw play out as of late in Venezuela, where it looked like everything was going very well, the poor being given things, looks like there's enough excess that they can now distribute it, and so on and so forth. And then over a period of time, what you see is that, yeah, they distribute the wealth, but they distributed the wealth based upon the capitalist system. And when they went to the social system to bring about the results that were at the end of the capitalist productive process, then you saw something else kick in. That is that the producing class that was producing because they were actually incentivized to do so because they were benefiting from that personally by that which they were producing, they were getting the benefits of their own labor. But when you begin to pass that off, as the pause occurs and you begin to pass that wealth off to others who did not produce it, the producing class goes into a state of homeostasis where they are more or less put into a kind of economic sleeping stage where they're not incentivized to do anything because they are expropriating that which is produced and giving it out to those who did not produce it, to no advantage to those who did the work and brought the results about. So then they then are seeing the products being distributed. They're seeing the benefits going elsewhere. They then are not innovating, and therefore what is being spread doesn't have any utility over the long run because the persons that are producing don't replace the products that are being distributed. And we saw it looking very good at the very beginning, like in Venezuela, I was saying. But then as the process began to run its course over a period of time, we saw the end result was that, and we see it now, nothing's on the shelves. And we saw the same thing under Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And we see the same thing in Venezuela, not so much under Hugo Chavez, but we see it playing out under Hugo Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro. And under Maduro, we're now seeing the bottom falling out. And we're seeing it happening here as well. It's not. I don't think it's an accident that Bernie Sanders is running as a socialist, and he has numbers at his gatherings, political gatherings, in the Democratic Party, running as a Democratic socialist. He has more personnel at his gatherings as they have at any of the other candidates running, with the exception of Donald Trump. Trump is doing very well. But underneath Trump, in second place, is this socialist is out here talking about redistributing wealth. And why is that happening at this point in time? And I think you can see that it's happening because of certain things that are happening in the economy. And this idea of redistributing wealth comes along at a time when the capitalist system is on pause for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is that a lot of the entrepreneurs have picked up and gone elsewhere. Trump was talking about this in his speech in Mobile, Alabama last week, when he was talking about how the company Nabisco has pulled up roots in Chicago, I think it was, and now they're heading toward Mexico. He was talking about the Ford plant. They picked up roots, and they're heading that way. And they are getting out of Dodge, and some people, by the way, are even renouncing their American citizenship because people are going to go where the markets are freer. There was a report on radio this past weekend, and it was reported that we've lost 3 additional slots as far as being the freest economy in the world. We were number 17, I think, at the beginning of, was it the beginning last week, week before last, and now we are now down to number 17. In other words, we've lost 3 slots in the immediate time period in terms of the economy being less free. And so the economy, what is happening with our economy as it becomes less free, then dollars are being attracted elsewhere, where the investments can be made in a more free environment because innovation and expansion of production takes place in a freer environment. Does not take place in an environment where there is less freedom. And so it runs to places like Hong Kong And it really, as quiet as it's kept, is right into Mexico because Mexico's economy is freer than the economy of the United States. These people say people coming out of Mexico to the United States. That's not necessarily the way it is. Of course, the persons coming here are the derelicts coming in, as Donald Trump said. But a lot of the people coming in here from Mexico are not coming from Mexico, coming through Mexico, from other parts of Latin America, from South America, Central America, from the West Indies, and they're going through Mexico to arrive here, but not coming necessarily from Mexico itself, because the economy in Mexico is growing at a faster pace than it's growing in the United States. That's not too well known, but that is really a fact when you go look at the numbers. And I do not accept that these numbers that we've been given right now indicate how well the economy is doing, because I don't see the economy doing the things they're saying this economy is in fact doing. There's no way in the world that the unemployment rate can be 5.5 to 5.6%. Not when you look at the labor participation rate. And you have 92 million people out of the workforce, and you have 50 million people that are receiving some kind of federal aid as far as food stamps and welfare.
And another thing is too, if Mexico's economy is growing, why hasn't that the mass exodus from Mexico ceased? They got job opportunities now in their country that we don't have, and they're not going to let us go over to their country and work. I guess they do have a provision now where Americans have to pay for the right to come into their country to work for 6 months. They have to pay so much. Okay. How long are they going to extend that? And is the prices or the fees for that going to be going up? We never put that fee on them.
Yeah.
So we always constantly do this.
It is managed.
We always allow the better trading we give the better trade deal to China. Mm-hmm. They don't give us the same. They don't reciprocate or give us the same access to their markets we give them to ours. We always do that. I mean, Ross Perot is absolutely right. Go to anybody you're doing business with, say, give us the same deal we're giving you. If not, we're not going to do business. Why the hell we don't do that? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, we never do that.
You have to manage your immigration, and you need immigrants. It's a long story about why, but you need immigrants in your country, because you have to create a consumer class as well as a productive class. You have to sell it. Once you produce the products, you have to sell the products too, but you have to manage the immigration so that you're bringing in the people that you need. Part of it is an age situation. For example, if you have someone producing potato chips, you don't bring in your immigration if you're trying to sell. If your manufacturer is a potato chip manufacturer, you don't bring in people that are under 50. Age percentile, because they're not the ones that are going to produce. They're going to buy that product that's produced. So you have to look and see what the immigration needs of the country are. You cannot have it done helter skelter, that people just coming in at their own will and you're not managing immigration. There are Americans that are immigrating to Mexico, but Mexico manages the immigration. They need certain persons that are skilled workers that can manage the plants, for example, that are going in that direction. And we have the greatest skilled class in the world in this country. So then that class goes into those places that need those skills. But not everybody is going to be migrating down there. We had one person that was in the military stuck his toe across the lands of the Mexican border, and got disoriented, didn't know where he was, and just drove down the wrong street and arrived in Mexico, and they put him in jail. Because you're not going in these countries and just flooding into those countries, and then they adopt you in those countries as a part of the citizenry that is going on there, as they're doing here, in very ridiculous ways. You can watch the debate that's going on right now about the 14th Amendment. And those of you that know about why the amendment was added to the Constitution, I'm going to read the relevant parts to you, but those who know why it was added to the Constitution know it was added to the Constitution in 1868 because we had to normalize the citizenship, or to really regularize the status of the newly freed slaves in this country who had just been freed 3 years earlier by the 13th Amendment, where slavery was in fact outlawed in the United States by the amendment was added to the Constitution in 1865 when the so-called Civil War, which really was a tax war, ended in this country, having been fought between 1861 and 1865. When that war came to a close, because the Emancipation Proclamation had spoken to the slavery in the rebellious states, an amendment was now needed to, in fact, bring slavery to a conclusion in what really were the Union states, because there were 4 Union states that were in the so-called Civil War that had slaves: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. There were 800,000 slaves between the 4 of them. So then the 13th Amendment was passed to outlaw slavery throughout the United States, since the Emancipation Proclamation had touched upon the slave situation in the rebellious states, 11 states that had sought to secede from the Union. Well, this was really a tax war, and it became a war over slavery once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. But that was 2 years into the war, when Lincoln didn't have any other choice but to because they were losing the war, but to use the military edict to bring that result about. Anyway, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution as well after the 13th Amendment was passed. Then we have to talk about then what we do with the slaves who have been freed by the 13th Amendment. And by the 14th Amendment, then you have this language added to the Constitution as well, and it says in the first sentence, and I want to read it to you because I think it's self-explanatory, but we'll explain it here, nevertheless. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now, that language is not really language that equivocates about what is being offered here. For example, if it is said all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, then that would mean that there are no preemptive measures in the language that is cut and dried, that if you're born and naturalized here in the United States, you are automatically a citizen of the United States. But it doesn't say that. It adds a clause to it. And that clause starts with the word "and." So all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. That clause is very important. And no one has explained that better than Mark Levine, who has run a clinic on this question, more so than others. And I don't think that many persons have understood it. Certainly Bill O'Reilly, who talked about it last week, didn't understand it, because he was trying to say that if you come across a border one day before your child is born, and your child is born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. You are a citizen of this country. And that is not what that provision allows for. I just read its provision, and I said earlier that if it is said all persons born naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, then that would be true. But it has that "and" in there, which is overlooked, and it says "and subject to the jurisdiction thereof." So you can, if you are born in the United States, but you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, then you're not a citizen just by being born in the United States. And why did they put that particular provision in there? Because the Native Americans were under the jurisdiction of their own tribal governments, and therefore, if they were born here, they were not citizens here. They weren't made citizens of the country until 1924. But you cannot claim that the framers were thinking about immigration when they put that language in there, because immigration was not a problem in the country. There were no persons that were excluded from coming into the country, except those that they passed provisions to exclude them from coming. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Otherwise, there was no exclusion. But the citizenship was a different issue. You had to be made citizens through the fact that you were naturalized in the country. There's a process that you went through. And the court, which made a ruling in 1898 in the Wong case, and I forget the state in which it occurred, but I read that court case. And in that case, in the court's ruling, which the court made it 2 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the court's ruling in 1896 of separate but equal, the court ruled upon the fact that Wong, who had been born in the United States to parents who were legal immigrants, but he had left out of the country and came back, and had never had any other country that he was under the jurisdiction of but the United States. And when he came back to the country, they would not let him in the country because he was not, quote unquote, a naturalized citizen. And he sued for entry into the country. And the court then said that this provision on both levels, born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the laws of the country, because he was 20 years old before he left the country. He is subject to the jurisdiction of the laws therein. But if you have a child, let's say that you do what they are claiming now, that you have a child who you just crossed over into the border, you knew you were going to have the child within a matter of hours, and you cross the border and have the child in the United States. How is that child subject to the jurisdiction of the laws of this country when this child is not able at that point to have made a pledge of whether the jurisdiction will be that of this country or the country of the mother? The child clearly has the jurisdiction that the mother has, and the mother's jurisdiction is the country that they came from, not this country. And to say that they are under the laws of this country because they just came here would say then that the country where they came from has no jurisdiction over them. When I left out and went to Europe, if I had gotten in trouble while I was in Europe, I would have had to go to contact the American Embassy. The American Embassy would have been the one that I would have had to go to for the settlement of my problem, because I'm under the jurisdiction of the American government, although I was in another country. The jurisdiction is the country of the mother. And the mother's jurisdiction is the country that she came from. Even if she steps a toe over here, the jurisdiction still goes back to the country that she came from. And using the 14th Amendment to say otherwise is nonsense. And you have to read it very carefully for yourself in order to see what the language requires. And the court has gotten confused itself, because later on it went one step further than it did in the Wong case, where it was ruling upon a child, really not at that point a child, a 20-year-old man, and it really was a citizen. And that is true based upon the language, because he is born in the United States, and the only jurisdiction he ever had was the jurisdiction of the United States. He grew up in the country. That's a different circumstance. Subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. He had not known any other jurisdiction. But a child hasn't known any jurisdiction, so it's the jurisdiction in that case of the mother. And the mother has to take responsibility for that child. I think Ben Carson is right in saying what you do, because you don't want to split they say, well, we're going to split the family up. What Ben Carson said last week, we don't want to split the family up. We wanted to deport both the mother and the child and put them back in the country where the mother came from. And that is the going rate as to what should go on. And they're trying to make Trump into, what's that word they're using now? He used the word anchor baby. And now that's a term that's offensive. And they're saying that he's, what's the phobia they've named now? Some other phobia that they've created. But it is what Trump is saying. If you don't have borders, if the country does not have sovereignty, then it's not a country. If you have open borders, people just come into your country and you can't define your population from one day to another, you're not a country. And this problem has got to be resolved. It's going to be interesting to see what the court does with it. Because I know that political correctness is one way in which the court makes its rulings today. But the Constitution does not allow for this extended idea that you come across the border and you're automatically a citizen of this country. That's not in the language. And the court has gotten confused because they made another ruling that expanded upon what it did in 1898. And it had a court case in 1921, I think it was, where it went one step further and began to make this claim that it was in fact being consistent with the claim made in 1898 when it made Wong a citizen. It did not see that the particular issue there was not a baby, but a person that was 20 years old. We really have not had a court case right now that tested the proposition directly of whether a person coming into the country, born in the country, to parents that are not citizens and that are here illegally, is that person that is born to those parents a person that is a citizen of the United States. We've not had a court case on that. And I'm very interested in what this court would do. And if it bases upon the Constitution, it would rule that is not the case. Even if it rules that it is the case, it's ruling inappropriately to what's required and stated in the Constitution, because the Constitution does not lend itself to anyone coming in here having a child becomes an automatic citizen. And that's because of the language I just read to you a few minutes ago. But we have an outlaw Supreme Court now, and we have an outlaw Congress, and we have an outlaw executive branch of government. And it's going to take an outside intervention to bring the result about. There's a book that I read while I was on my trip. It's called Official Lies: How Washington Misleads Us, written by two outstanding scholars, James T. Bennett and Dr. Thomas DeLorenzo. I've been talking about him quite a bit in some of the other books he's written, books on Lincoln, for example. And his book called How Capitalism Saved America, which is a classic. And this book talks about how we cannot really correct the problems in Washington, because the problems have got to be corrected from the outside. You're not going to correct this problem from the inside. In fact, I see the inside component of the problem by what we see with the Iranian deal that was now being placed before the Congress, and they are supposed to be voting upon what was supposed to be negotiations with Iran. And really, there's no actual negotiation that went on with Iran. What Iran did was sit at the table and tell you what they will do and what they were not going to do, and we signed it and said we had a negotiated agreement. We didn't negotiate with anything with Iran. Iran sat there and drew up their own terms, and told the U.S. representatives where to get off, and it just leaked out that the agreement, quote unquote, was that Iran will in fact bring about its own inspection on whether or not it's in compliance with the agreement. In other words, they will assign to themselves whether or not they are in compliance with the agreement. They're going to determine that by choosing the ones to go in there and see if they're doing what they said they're going to do. And of course they're in agreement, because if you appoint the person that are going to say whether or not you're in agreement, and you want to appoint them to that particular task, then they're going to say those who are the taskmasters put them there. They're going to say what they put them there to say. It's just like in the United States. If you pay some scientists to look and see if there's global warming, and their grants are based upon the group that's paying them to look at the issue, understand something about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, what's the word here? The bureaucracy suffer fools gladly, but it does not suffer critics gladly. So if you're appointed by a committee, and the committee pretty much knows, by the way, what your proclivities are, what your intentionalities are, based upon prior work that you've done, so they kind of know what the predictables are when you're appointed. But if you get in those committees, you start going haywire and making contradictions, saying the committee is in fact off the mark and so on and so forth, you can believe you're not getting any further grants. And that's why the scientists get in lockstep with the committee that is in fact appointing them, because they understand what the money means there. You only get grants as long as you're going along with the conclusions drawn by that particular committee. So those who are appointed to do research on global warming, you're going to find global warming. And if it's global cooling, then you're going to find global cooling. If carbon dioxide is going rate in terms of it being a problem, don't forget carbon dioxide is plant food. And in a world where you have people starving, more carbon dioxide and therefore more plant food means that you have a longer growing season and you have more food being produced as a result, and therefore you can feed more people. But they're saying it's a problem because the committee that hired them to say that said it was a problem, and therefore they're following that particular rate. Well, wouldn't you know it, that in Article 2, Clause 2, Section 2, let me read that to you. Let me find Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. Because what you have in Iran is that you have a treaty that was in fact negotiated between, we say negotiated, get that in all kinds of quotes. But between Iran and the United States, that we have a treaty. Now, what happens when you have a treaty? Well, what's supposed to happen, according to Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, let me read this to you. Here's what happens in a treaty. Article 2 sets up the executive branch of government. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch of government in the first article. So we have the second article setting up after you set up the one that makes the laws, you then set up the branch of government that enforces the laws, which is the executive branch. So that in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, here's what it says. Since the presidents were assumed to be male, it used the word he. He should have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Did anybody see the Senate giving any advice and consent during the time negotiations were going on, quote unquote, negotiations were taking place? He should have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Okay. Is that the process you see taking place with this process? What is taking place in the process? The president has used the treaty as if he is proposing a law to be passed by the Congress, which is really astounding, because in Article 1, the Congress, which is the lawmaking body, proposes laws to be passed, through which is then placed, once it passes both the House and the Senate, then it goes to the President for his approval or his disapproval as part of the check and balance system. But in this case, the President is proposing not a treaty, which is what this is really his right to do, and that's what this is that is being proposed, but in the form of a law, but not initiated by the Congress, but by the President. And is being put in front of the House and the Senate. Let me read to you again what Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 calls for. And shall make treaties, provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur. There's not even a role in it for the members of the House. Only members of the Senate. Now, why would that be the case? That's the case because at the time when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, what they ratified was the Constitution where the senators in Article 1, Section 3, where you have the election of senators, they were to be elected by the state legislatures. So then in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, you have how you're going to, in Article 1, Section 2, you're going to have how you elect members of the House of Representatives. In Article 1, Section 3, you're going to have how you elect senators. Members of the House elected by the people, members of the Senate elected by the state legislatures. So that means that the senators were to be elected by the states. And therefore, by putting the Senate in control of the ratification of the Constitution, what they were saying here was that the states must agree to it. The federal government can make a treaty through the executive branch, but before it becomes law and becomes part of the international agreement agreed to by the United States, it must in fact pass the states by a 2/3 majority. That would be 67 of the senators. And look at this other part of it. Because it is agreed to or not agreed to by the states, the president has nothing further to say about it because the states are in charge. That was the idea. Now, we've changed the way we elect the senators in the country by the 17th Amendment added to the Constitution in 1913, when these progressives have now taken charge of the federal government, starting under Theodore Roosevelt, and now we have them in full swing now in 1913. In fact, I contend that in 1913, that America stopped being a free country. Now, it wasn't realized in 1913 because it takes time for that to filter through and down to the political system in the country. It takes time for that to in fact marinate, but we are there now.
Didn't even Woodrow Wilson claim that after he realized what he did, he said, I unwittingly destroyed my own nation? I think Woodrow Wilson has even said that.
Yes,
so.
It wasn't clear at that time, John, but as it began to unfold, they began to realize that they had in fact unharnessed a monstrosity here. You see, the thing you have to keep in mind about the why the 16th Amendment is so dangerous, and the framers were so correct in their view that you should not have a direct tax. See, the income tax, the federal income tax, is a direct tax. It was forbidden to the federal government, not forbidden to the states, but because the states are the ones that will decide within their own borders if they're going to have a direct tax or not, but the federal government cannot do it. And that was another way of limiting government, because if you don't have the purse strings, You cannot have the expansion of government going into areas where it was not allowed to go. So then, not only Article 1, Section 8 limits the government through the enumeration of powers, or the separation of powers through the three branches of government also limits power, but you also have a limit in terms of government not being able to grow itself because it doesn't have access to the purse strings. So there's no direct taxation. But when the 16th Amendment is added to the Constitution and changes that, so you have a direct tax, it is a direct tax that establishes tyranny in the United States. And is not immediately felt at the outset because they were saying, well, we're only going to tax the ones at a certain income bracket. And I have to tell you something else, a little side point here, is that when they start saying that the wealthy ones, the people that are wealthy are not paying their fair share, that's not true. What is happening with the wealthy class is because they don't have, in a democratic, setting, they don't have the numbers to threaten the political class. They then put more taxes upon them because they don't have the numbers to deal with the political class, and therefore they're overtaxed. You see, the Constitution calls for a proportional taxation. So then, if you say, for example, that the top 1%, if they take out of the economy, let's say 1% of the wealth, 12% of the wealth. Let's say they have 12% of the wealth. Then that class should pay 12% of the taxes. That's how the proportional taxes are supposed to go. So when you have the 1%, which takes out of the economy 16% of the wealth, let's say that would be what their part of the wealth is in the economy, and they're paying 38 to 40% of the taxes, those taxes are not proportional. And then the top 5% paying 60% of the taxes, and the top 10% paying 70% of the taxes. Now, look at the other part of it. The ones that are not paying their fair share would be the ones at the bottom percentage. The bottom 47%, which practically pays no tax. And that, of course, is for what reason? Because what you're doing there is you are keeping those who are most able to rise up against taxation. You are keeping them quiet. You're really buying them off through by the appropriation of the money of those at the top that don't have the numbers, buying them off by not taxing that class and taxing the ones here and claiming they're not paying their fair share. They're paying their fair share. But this is tyranny that you see operative here. And I guarantee you that no politician will ever say what the fair share is of those at the top income levels, because if they name a figure, we'll already see they've exceeded that figure. That's why the income that they take is always about more. It's never about a number. So we have an unfair tax structure in place, and we have money fleeing the United States. We have businesses fleeing the United States. And Donald Trump, I think, understands that. And because he is a pro-capitalist, he is in fact beginning to discuss this. And hopefully as we discuss it, it becomes very well known throughout the society. The American can make a choice between whether it wants to go down the road that Bernie Sanders is talking about or go down this capitalist road, because we're going to have to make a choice in 2016. Okay, there are a lot of things going on. Pay attention to it, because some interesting things are now happening in the political process. The stock market, let's see what's happening with that over the course of the next few days. And also, let's pay attention to the campaign that's being revved up on both sides of the political divide of the two parties, really one party, the incumbent party, that has two different wings to it. Okay, we're getting ready for the program coming up at 3:30. That's Satura's Black History Corner, starring the two Catherines, Catherine Hunter Williams and Miss Catherine Blake. And they'll be coming to you in about 20 minutes. And the program called Satura's Black History Corner, and I'll be going home to watch it live. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, as always, I always say here at the close that if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.